You're listening and watching another episode of the Wildcast podcast. Justin Spears here with Michael Lev and Arizona basketball insider Bruce Pascoe. For the next X amount of minutes, we're going to be talking about Arizona losing to Clemson in the Sweet 16. Another disappointing finish for the Wildcats as their season comes to an end. Bruce is calling in all the way from Los Angeles in his hotel. And you know, Lev, you've also been following the season from start to finish. This team showed that they are one of the best teams in college basketball. I mean, when they were playing their best brand, man, you'd be hard pressed to find another team outside of maybe UConn that could beat Arizona. But man, against Clemson, they just kind of stunk it up. There's a lot of things that happened in that game, but shooting 18%, a lot of breakdowns, especially late. It didn't seem like an Arizona team that was playing like the team that we've seen all season long. I guess, Lev, we'll start with you. What are your thoughts on what happened against Clemson?
Yeah, it was one of those games where you could kind of tell in the first few minutes that it was not going to be Arizona's night. They almost overcame their shooting woes. It's kind of borderline miraculous that they were as close as they were at the end of the game, considering how poorly they shot the ball. It's very easy to fall into that trap, I feel like, when you're facing a zone defense, just kind of using the 3-point shot as a solution to that problem. And sometimes the shots go down and sometimes they don't. And I worried after the Long Beach State game where they took a season high 35 3-pointers that they were going to kind of fall into that trap again. And it happened. There was not a lot of, getting the ball into the middle of the zone. There wasn't a lot of inside out game. To me, there's a difference between like a good 3-point attempt and the types of, threes that they were shooting against Clemson. They weren't like heavily contested, but they weren't quote unquote good shots, that were born out of ball movement, moving that zone around. So that was one, huge issue, obviously. Overall guard play, which is exactly what Bruce wrote about coming into the Sweet 16, remained an issue. The starting guards did not produce in this game, and really they've all kind of been slumping since that USC game, which I got to say, that regular season finale, I kind of wrote it off as just, a meaningless game, doesn't matter. The bad habits that were created in that game carried over. And I feel like they haven't been quite the same since.
Yep, that's exactly the case. USC, they came into the tournament losing 2 of 3 games, and I think they got a big risk advantage losing to Oregon. But both USC and Oregon threw them off with the zones. I think, like you said, Michael, you could attribute part of the game at USC to having won the Pac-12 title 2 nights earlier at UCLA. A little bit of a letdown there, but definitely some red flags. And they had shown problems against the zone and some really bad shooting games, especially at Washington State. They were just horrible, dealing with that zone. It seems like a zone not only keeps them sometimes from getting inside or trying to drive inside, and they just settle for shots, and then it just throws them out of rhythm. And then that carries over on the other end of the floor. And defensively, they're not creating anything, and because they're not creating anything defensively, they don't get their fast breaks and get all that juice from all that stuff, and it just kind of snowballs. And we've seen this happen over and over. And I thought it would happen at some point in the tournament. I didn't think it would necessarily happen in the Sweet 16. I thought maybe it'd be more likely against one of the 2 teams they might have played on Saturday. But I think that to your point too, Michael, I think they could have. They basically could have lost a lot bigger. And I think a big part of the reason is Clemson played a game Sunday night. They went home for 12 hours. They had to fly across the country. They were tired. You could tell they were missing shots a lot in the second half where they bounced off the front of the rim. That's usually a sign that you're tired. And Arizona couldn't beat a team like that. That's troubling for them.
Yeah. Bruce, on the radio show today, we had a couple phone callers call in, and they said, when I listened to Brian Jeffries, he said that the team skipped morning shoot around the day of the game. Have you heard about that? Have you looked into that? And
No,
I found
we
that.
don't have.
Okay.
But no, I mean, I've been swamped. Somebody sent me an email about that too. I'm not really sure how much that matters, because they, in these situations, a lot of times they'll just do walkthrough stuff at the hotel. I don't know, honestly. We've had no access to anybody since after the game, and I didn't know about that until after the access had been cut off. So no, I don't know.
Okay. Because when I heard that, I'm like, that could partially play a role into them shooting 18% from 3-point range. And Caleb Love, I mean, he couldn't hit anything. He was 0 for 9 from 3-point range.
Right, but both Lev and Boswell have been struggling since the game at USC down the street here a few weeks ago. They just, it wasn't really, they've had a couple of bright spots here and there, but it's been a little bit of a trend. And it's just they just didn't get any other support. Bradley himself wasn't enough. Umar Bala was good when he could get the ball, but he had trouble at the line, obviously, too. So it was just it was sort of again, kind of a lot of things come together.
I have no idea whether they did or didn't do shoot around, but I have gone to enough games to see they put up a gazillion shots before the game starts, right? I mean, there's like multiple warm-up periods, and they are shooting and shooting and shooting. I don't think that's an excuse.
Well, yeah, and they did have a full practice on Wednesday at Crypto Arena. So
as you pointed out, Bruce, they had a shorter commute from Tucson. They had way more time to rest and prepare. So there's really no excuse whatsoever for their poor play. I got to say, the Love thing is absolutely inexplicable. Like, how could a guy play so well for basically the first 30? I think it was the first 30 games of the season. I had him at around 43% shooting. And then in the last 6 games, he could not make a shot. Yeah. I'm like sitting there watching, like, does this guy need to go to the eye doctor? Like, and a lot of the misses were way off too. They weren't ones where it was like, oh, it was like halfway down and it rattled out. Like, I mean, he wasn't close. Yeah. It was very strange. I don't know if that's just like a mental thing.
It's like golf. You got the yips or something like that.
Maybe so.
I actually used the word yips in my story today, Justin. I mean, like, literally, it was that, and Ball had him at the line. It was like, Ball he's had bad days at the line, but
been around 50%. Yeah.
Yeah. Not
you're going to get 1 point out of those trips.
Yeah. But, I think part of Love is he's just carried the weight of being the go-to guy all season. And he's been struggling, and he's in a slump. It's just like you see in baseball or something else. It just tends to build on you, and it gets mental at some point. I think that's what it is. He's been carrying a big burden. He had a lot to prove because whatever happened at North Carolina last season, and maybe he felt like he's super anxious about trying to get to play them and beat them on Saturday and looking ahead a little bit. Who knows? But I'm sure he's a really good player. So it's got to be at least somewhat mental. There's just no question about it.
Well, I think RJ Davis was also looking forward to that game too, because he also stunk up the joint. Went 0 for 9.
It just goes to show you these guys are human. They get in slumps. They get mental blocks. There's a lot of pressure on them. Clemson obviously had no pressure. They didn't have they were playing on fumes physically, but they had zero pressure on them, and they haven't been to an Elite Eight since 1980 or whatever it is. So it's all good for them. They had nothing to worry about, but a lot of pressure on Arizona, a lot of early exits, and again, Love trying to prove some things, and he couldn't do it.
So this stat was floating around last night about Arizona falling to considerably lower seeds in the tournament 6 years in a row.
4 seeds or higher?
6 times in a row. Higher seed, lower seed, however you want to do that. And it's obviously happened 3 times now under Tommy Lloyd. So my question for you, Bruce, is like, how do you assess Tommy Lloyd's first 3 seasons here? What kind of a job has he done?
Honestly, I think he wins too many games in November. I think that's a big part of the problem because they haven't lost in November. Expectations get raised super high. Because of those early wins. Nowadays, the tournament committee considers the whole resume. Not that they used to back in the day. They used to only consider, or they put heavier weight on the last 10 games If they did that this year, Arizona wouldn't have been a 2 seed. They would have been a 3 or a 4, maybe, who knows, maybe even a 5. But they win a lot, and then I think expectations get raised up. And this year particularly, they were high because the Final Four is in Phoenix, and it's easy to make that connection. They've got this West Coast path to get to Phoenix. They should be able to get there. Just like in 2017, they had a path through the West to get to Phoenix, and lost in the Sweet 16. So it happens. But I think I actually asked Lloyd about this. It's interesting because college basketball is defined by the postseason. It's defined by the tournament. He knows that. Everybody knows that. But I think if you look at his body of work, you say, he's won in 2 years. He resurrected a program that is in major NCAA, FBI, whatever, blah, 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 fired a coach, all kinds of stuff. Changed that, got past it, changed the culture, won 2 Pac-12 regular season titles, 2 tournament titles, and then fell short in the tournament. So it's dependent on how you look at it. If you do define it by the tournament, 2 weekends in the tournament, then yeah, it's not been good. But if you look at the whole body work, it's been at least as good as you could have expected, considering where the Wildcats were in April of 2021. So
and
that's what I would say.
Well, and this is why I think the move to the Big 12 is really going to help out Arizona, because you can put together a very strong non-conference schedule, which Arizona did this year. But I think maintaining that strong schedule over the course of the season is going to get you battle tested. And yeah, you may not be a 2 seed for Arizona. You may be a 3 or 4 or a 5 seed, but you won't have moments like this where you just put up a goose egg like Arizona did against Clemson.
Yeah, that's been the buzz around the program. I think it's interesting because like literally everybody I've talked to within Arizona, around other Pac-12 schools, nobody's happy about this except the Arizona basketball program. I think they believe that they will get more battle tested, as you say, Justin, in the Big 12, and that overall long term it'll be better because they know, unlike maybe some people, they know that college basketball is defined in the postseason.
Yeah.
And so if they finish 5th in the Big 12, so what? They're still going to get in the tournament. They can still get to the Final Four. That's what they're looking at, and I think that's the upside. The downside is going to be travel and all that, but they fly charter. It's not that big a deal.
Is it better in a certain respect to be seated lower because the expectations are maybe lower, the pressure is a little bit less? Like I sensed watching that game last night that it just seemed like Arizona felt the weight.
Mm-hmm.
Like the pressure was getting to them, whether that was Balo at the line or just all the missed shots early in the game, missed layups. Like one team, to me, Clemson, just seemed like they had played like they had nothing to lose.
Yep.
It's just free and easy. And Arizona was at the opposite end of that.
Especially in we've seen that over and over in the tournament, especially with a higher seeded team and one who hasn't been there for a long time. And I think that builds on it. And the players may not focus on that or try not to think about it, but everybody talks about it all the time. And it's been 23 years now since they've been in the Final Four. And I think Arizona fans, you think about, Zona Zoo or whatever they called it back in the 90s when Lute Olson was building up and going to Final Fours. Those students are now middle-aged fans, and they're like, why haven't we been to the Final Four since 2001? And it's frustrating to them. And I think it trickles down to the players. I think they feel it a little bit, Michael. Yeah, I think you're right. And it's a burden. And as we all know, which is why the tournament's, so attractive to some people, but it's also a situation where it's one and done. If it was the NBA playoffs or the, a FIBA round robin or whatever, one game, you wouldn't feel that kind of pressure. They could have an off night and then come back and win 2 or 3 or 4 or whatever it would take. But
yeah,
the pressure is just amplified when you only have one 40-minute stretch to do it.
This is a dangerous game to play, but I'm going to ask you to look into your crystal ball a little bit, Bruce, as far as the roster goes. Who do you think is going to leave? Go pro? Who do you think might transfer? Just go through kind of some of the kind of key guys.
Whole new
What
starting
do you think-
five.
What do you think the future holds? Yeah.
I think that Mick Cronin said it best a couple weeks ago at the Pac-12 tournament. He's like, everybody's a free agent. Like literally, every year I would kind of try and do that, but you can't do that anymore because it used to be like guys who were frustrated would transfer, guys who were good would go pro. Now it's that plus anybody who's pretty good might want to get in the portal anyway and see what kind of offers,
see what happens. Yeah.
what kind of money's out there. And so literally anything could happen. So I'd hesitate to say anything, but I did kind of, through the course of the postseason, try and check with each guy to get at least a feeling of how they're leaning. And, I would say like Philip Borovichinin, for example, he's a classic case of a guy who's, been through 2 years, hasn't really made a move into the lineup. Usually like Adama Ball last year, that kind of player is going to look to leave. But, I think Paulius Morauskas is interesting to me because he's played on a high level in Lithuania. He's pretty well regarded over there. And, he didn't get barely a sniff here at Arizona. So I wouldn't be surprised if he just said, the heck with this, I'm going back to Lithuania or whatever, and then I think as far as the starters go, you've got three, you got four of them basically got eligibility to return. So, I wouldn't be surprised if all of them at least test the NBA draft. I think it's most likely that of those four guys, I'm saying that Keyshawn Johnson is out of eligibility. Nobody else is. But I would think Ballo is probably the most likely to return just because he's enjoying it here. I think he can do well in the NIL space or whatever you want to call it versus going out and testing it as a pro, where I don't think right now he's a two-way candidate or anything like that. So he might be better off staying. But Larson's kind of risen on the boards. Boswell, I don't know. People still like him. So, maybe he gives it a shot. And then Caleb Love is the same way. And I asked, both Larson and Love and last night, and they said they hadn't decided. They didn't say they definitely wanted to do one or the other, but I think, that they'll probably test it. I think honestly, so I think we're getting down. I'm looking at the roster thinking, I think most likely KJ Lewis seems to be pretty locked in for another year. The red shirts and Dylan Anderson seem to be pretty committed to coming back next year when I've talked to about him. But heck, other than that, it's really hard to say.
So you've got Lewis, Bradley, and Krivas, right?
Well, and Jaden Bradley's really interesting to me because he's not like high on the draft boards, but I got to think he's helped himself the last few weeks, and he's a McDonald's All-American. I think he would at least test the draft, and he might even be one of those guys who tests. And I don't know, he does seem pretty happy. So maybe if he stayed in college, he'd stayed at Arizona. But it seems like the big trend now is guys test and at the same time put their names in the portal. And then they see what kind of NIL, if they don't make it in the NBA, if it doesn't look good enough, then they'll have their agent see who's going to pay the most to go somewhere else in college. And that's what they do. And, in fact, Grant Nelson, he did that last year. Arizona was kind of looking at him, went back and chose Alabama, and he had a great game last night. So, I don't know what his, how it worked out for him to go there, but those kind of things happen. So who knows with Bradley? But I will say he does seem pretty happy, and he's been amazingly patient and gracious with what he's gotten, the opportunities he's gotten, because you think he could be a pretty bitter guy who said, "Hey, I should be starting for this team, or I should be playing 25 minutes a game," and he's not even sniffed that. And people I've asked about him say he's like that really genuinely. So I don't know. Maybe it might depend on what happens with Kylan Boswell. Does one of them leave? Does Boswell leave for one thing or another, and then Bradley knows he's coming back as the number one guy? Maybe that's appealing to him, and he stays. That could be very likely. But it's really tough to say right now.
I don't know. The end of the season, I kind of sat back and I'm like, wait a second, I've seen this movie before. It seems like Kylan Boswell is kind of getting the Kirk Kriisa treatment from a year ago, where he kind of disappears a little bit. Now fans are clamoring for him to go. There's a player right behind him that is performing at a very high level. Like Jaden Bradley, I think he made a strong case that he should be in the starting lineup for Arizona. And going into next season, is Jaden Bradley going to be totally okay coming off the bench if he does come back. And so to me, it almost seems like maybe it's going to be a repeat of what happened with Kirk Kriisa. Does Kylan Boswell enter the transfer portal and Jaden Bradley ends up taking over the starting role?
Yeah.
But I also give Kylan the benefit of the doubt because he's also 18 years old. Like, technically, this should have been his true freshman season. So I give him a little bit of grace. But, man, there was a lot of inconsistency this year. Like, Kylan Boswell would have one good game, and then he would have a stretch of 5 games. And then people are wondering what's going on with Kylan Boswell. He steps up, and then he goes back to just kind of being very pedestrian.
Yeah, how do you explain Bruce? He seems so passive out there sometimes. You know, like even when Caleb Love's struggling, at least he's trying stuff. You know,
Yeah.
Maybe it's ill-advised, but he's driving. He's putting up shots. Like Kylan seemed like he'd just kind of retreat a little bit if his shot wasn't falling early in the game. I don't know if that's just like maturity or what, but he was kind of just a non-factor in a lot of these games down the stretch.
Yeah. I that's a great question. I don't know. I think it is related to age and maturity and just some maybe underlying confidence there. I mean, he talks very confidently, but you do see that a little bit in games that things aren't going right. He just kind of shies away from what he does really well. I mean, he's a very talented player in a lot of ways. And I think that's why NBA guys are still looking at him. He has some things about him, but you wonder, you're right. He is only 18. We all know that. But he's had almost 2 full years. He missed, he wasn't much early last year because of his injury, but he's had a lot of time to adjust. So I don't know. It's really hard to say. And I think to your point, Justin, it's interesting. It's hard to imagine both those guys would be back next year. And, maybe if, one of them leaves for whatever reason, maybe they're both better off where whatever happens to them. And, and if it's Bradley coming back as the number 1 guy, and that's I could see that happening. And maybe Bradley would view that as a chance to really move up and, become like a first round pick or something, which he's probably not right now, but it's just, it's hard to say. And last year, you're right. With Kriisa, that's a really good comparison. It was ironic that Boswell was the guy who was pushing Kriisa at that point.
Yeah.
And then Kriisa went, and I think he got a decent deal out there in West Virginia. It was just, I think he got hurt. And then, of course, Bob Huggins got, lost his job, and it was, crazy stuff happened. But theoretically, it had a chance to work out good for both players and just didn't quite get there.
But the only reason why I'm so curious about Kylan Boswell, Jaden Bradley, and the guards is because I look at the guys who are coming in the upcoming recruiting class.
Yeah,
there's a lot of great perimeter players like Jamari Phillips, who's a combo shooting guard, and then who's the guy that just reclassified? Isn't he a wing or a perimeter player?
Yeah, Joseph Saxon. I just don't. Yeah, I don't know exactly how he fits. He will be young. I think. I don't see any of those guys being like super impact guys right away, but maybe they might have a chance to break the rotation. But it depends on what guys come back and does Lloyd go for veterans out of the portal. But it's going to be interesting
because I also looked at what the situation going on at Washington State, and all these players are leaving. And I saw that Miles Rice, the Pac-12 freshman of the year, is in the transfer portal. I think he'd be a great point guard at any school, including Arizona. Yeah.
I mean, I would be surprised if Arizona didn't at least, pick up the phone with him and a lot of those Washington State players, because they've got a situation. They just lost their coach. They don't know what league they're going to be in. I mean, they do for the next year. They're sort of an affiliate of the WCC, but that's a rough situation. And it might be tough to just, Stanford doesn't take many transfers if they want to follow Kyle Smith there. So where are those guys going? Yeah. And you're right. Miles Rice is sort of the opposite of Kylan Boswell. He's a freshman point guard who's 20, almost 21, I think at this point, third year player. I mean, really experienced and played well beyond his expectations out of high school at the same time. Really, really interesting prospect he is.
You have to think that Arizona will pull a few guys out of the portal. I mean, there's no shortage of intriguing players in there already, and there's undoubtedly going to be more to come. They're going to have to bring in some size, I would think. to me, that's where I would look because, the Big 12 is going to be rough and tumble, man. Like if Ballo doesn't come back, is
that's the thing.
Ready to,
Ballo and
down in there.
Yeah, that's true.
Krivas.
But Ballo and Krivas could both come back.
Yeah,
that wouldn't be a shock. And
they have Emmanuel Steffen too.
Yeah, and he's got a lot of upside. I'm not sure if he'll be ready right away, how much, but he's really got a lot of upside. Very athletic for his size too. Really.
The thing about Ballo is he undoubtedly has a future in Europe or abroad somewhere, but his game just doesn't fit the NBA at all. They're not even Zach Edey's like not even necessarily a lottery pick, which seems insane. Like to me, like if Zach Edey isn't an NBA player, I feel like the NBA is broken. But Ballo, he doesn't have any perimeter game at all. He's not probably ever going to develop any kind of a 3-point shot. So for him, it's either come back to Arizona for another year or probably pursue, something overseas, which is fine. I mean, you can carve out a great career doing that. I just don't see him in the NBA mix because of the way the game is played now.
Yeah, well, he's not on any of the draft boards. That's why I think he's the most likely of those senior guys to come back because he would probably do better, to come back to Arizona. He could maybe try and further expand his game. Maybe, Edey actually, I don't know if he can do what Edey did as far as that goes, but Edey did help himself quite a bit by coming back and, adding to his game with Purdue this year. And again, the NIL makes it a whole different deal because, guys don't have to come back. Guys can come back and do as well, potentially financially, it may be better than they can, if they're going to the pros, if they're marginal pros. So.
Shoot, NIL is the reason why G League Ignite no longer exists. I don't know if you guys saw that, but that got shut down because players are like, we can make more money in college.
Yeah.
Rather than playing in this league.
Yeah. Yeah. I think if you can get a 2-way deal, NBA G League, it's about $500,000, and that's probably better than you're going to do in college. So, but I think if you're below that and you're happy at college and maybe you can expand your game, you like the coaches, etc., why not come back? And I think that's what Zach Edey did, and maybe Ballo does too. Maybe even somebody else. We'll see.
Yeah. All right. So before we get out of here, you guys were talking about Tommy Lloyd's first 3 years as head coach and, falling short in the Sweet 16 a couple of times. And of course, Arizona fans are rabid. It's one of the most rabid fan bases in college basketball. And they are bringing their pitchforks and torches on Twitter, clamoring for Tommy Lloyd and his seat to get hot. And here's one thing that bodes well.
He just got a guaranteed 5-year contract. I don't think
he ain't going anywhere.
It could be very hot. It could be hot, but it's not. He's not leaving.
Yeah, but here's one thing I think
what happens when you sign a contract
that bodes well for Arizona, though. There was once upon a time before Bruce was even the beat writer with the Wildcats that people were going after Lute Olson, and after the 1988 Final Four. There was a stretch of time where Arizona would fall short in the NCAA tournament. Just looking at the postseason after the 88 Final Four, they lost in the Sweet 16, lost in the second round, lost in the Sweet 16, lost in the first round twice, and the year after that made the Final Four. And during that time, people were all over Lute Olson. And look what Lute Olson ended up doing in the years after that. Ended up building an elite college basketball program, an absolute powerhouse. Tommy Lloyd inherited great tradition and a great program in Arizona, but I think Arizona fans kind of need to pump the brakes a little bit because I think you can't win it every single year. And the fact that I think Tommy Lloyd has been to the Sweet 16 2 years to start, I think it bodes well. And eventually, I think Tommy Lloyd in Arizona will finally break through.
Yeah, if the worst thing that he's done, as Bruce said earlier, is win too much in November, then I think that's pretty good, right? Yeah. I mean, he's won 88 games overall in his first 3 seasons, and also like the first 3 seasons that he's ever been a head coach, right? Like Lute Olson had prior head coaching experience, Sean Miller had prior head coaching experience, so I'm writing a column about Tommy as we speak here. And one of the points that I tried to make was like, you can learn from your mistakes, and just because you haven't done something doesn't mean you're incapable of doing it.
Yeah.
Like, I think there's growth for him as a coach, and therefore growth for the program under his leadership.
I think he got out coached a little bit in that game against Clemson.
Sure.
Ignoring Umar Ballo, ignoring going inside, the defensive breakdowns late. But with that being said, even though you have a couple of mistakes, it doesn't mean that you're not a great coach. I still think at the end of the day, Tommy Lloyd is a great basketball mind and a great coach.
Well, it's interesting, Justin. Yeah, I think, and he's admitted a couple of times. I didn't hear it last night, although I wasn't in on his interview. I was in the locker room, but he has said a couple of times, "Hey, I'm still a young coach. I'm still growing." He's still in his third year as the guy making the decisions. So he's admitting that. And you're right, Michael, to your point, like, is there growth there? I think 3 years, arguably, it's still kind of a jury's out situation. And I think if you put the whole context of where this program was when he took it over, it's actually, exceeded expectations, in a lot of ways. It's just, and maybe if we're another 3 years down the road and they've still lost every time to a lower seeded team, then I think by then you could probably say, this is getting rough here, folks, or whatever. But, I think it's not, I think it's still we still got some kind of things to look at here as far as way it's going to go. And at the same time, we're talking about all this, Arizona being in this trouble and 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, et cetera. College sports is changing and they're navigating the NIL and the portal. And, it seems like they were a little more successful this year. They built up some NIL resources from what I understand at Arizona that's really helped. And, maybe that continues going. And then when it gets down to the games and the tournament, maybe we see some different things happen. It's just, I just feel like it's maybe a little bit early to be a definitive thing, especially when you're talking about, just a one and done situation. It's really tricky.
Yeah. To the point you brought up at the beginning of the podcast, too, Bruce, about expectations, like, what was Arizona's preseason ranking each of the last 3 years?
I think this
year they weren't ranked at all.
The first year they weren't. The first year they weren't, or last year. Wait, gosh, now I can't remember. But last year was very low because they had lost those 3 draft picks. And then this year, I believe they were about 14, 15, something like that preseason poll. And and I kind of looked at them like a team that I thought they'd probably win the Pac-12 and get to the second weekend, but I didn't think they were a Final Four team. I didn't think, Elite Eight, you never know, what depends on the matchups. But they really, when I go back to September, and I think I told, I don't know, I was telling some other people, I just feel like this is exactly where I figured they would be. I thought they'd lose 7 or 8 games, win the Pac-12, get to the second weekend. I didn't think they would suffer a Princeton type of deal. They had been through that, and that was a weird matchup, maybe somewhat of a one-off. So it's about what I expected. I just think, again, that they ratcheted up those expectations by going to Duke and beating them and just killing Wisconsin and rising to number 1. And that's rough when that happens. And what you were saying earlier, Justin, like Lute Olson did that a bunch of times too. He was also very good in November. There were jokes that, if the NCAA tournament was, held at Thanksgiving week, that he would have like, a dozen trophies or something.
He'd be in John Wooden range.
Yeah. So
how about December delirium?
Yeah.
March Madness.
It's just crazy. And, and nobody, most people nationwide anyway, aren't paying attention to college basketball then. And they just pay attention now. And then they see Arizona's like, oh, this team that loses every year early or whatever. Like, weren't they saying last week? It was like, can you trust Arizona in your bracket? Well,
I guess not.
Yeah. If that's the way you look at it.
Tommy Lloyd needs to avoid Big Cat teams. All of his losses in the tournament are against teams that have Big Cat as their mascots. Cougars and Tigers. All right. That'll do it for this episode of the Wildcast podcast. Appreciate you guys for listening and watching. Check us out on Tucson.com, Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. And for all of the off-season coverage of Arizona basketball, follow Bruce on Twitter or go to Tucson.com.